Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of current and classic horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews and discussions may include spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy.
Does anybody live here?
Well, not since 1963 when it happened. Every kid in Haddonfield thinks this place is haunted.
They may be right.
Seems to me you're just plain scared.
Yes, I am. I met him 15 years ago. I was told there was nothing left. No reason, no conscience, no understanding, and even the most rudimentary sense of life or death, of good or evil, right or wrong. I met this 6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes. I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
What do we do?
He's been here once tonight. I think he'll come back. I'm gonna wait for him.
I still think I should notify the radio and television.
No. If you do that, they'll see him in every street corner. They'll look for him in every house. Just tell your men to keep their mouths shut and their eyes open.
Welcome to another installment of my year-long Masters of Horror celebration, in which I'm joined by a guest every Friday to chat about one of their favorite films from our month's featured director. For the month of January, we're honoring none other than the legendary rebel of horror himself, John Carpenter. And today I'm joined by returning friend of the show, Mike, to chat about John Carpenter's Halloween. Mike, welcome back to the show, man.
Hey Jay, thanks for having me.
I always look forward to chatting horror movies with you. The film you picked today is, I'm excited always to talk about John Carpenter, but I'm especially excited to talk about Halloween because this was actually my first John Carpenter movie, and it's remained one of my favorite slashers, so I'm really looking forward to chatting about this with you today.
One of the all-time greats.
So you picked John Carpenter's third feature film for us to chat about, Halloween, which he directed and co-wrote with his creative partner and producer Deborah Hill. The film centers around 15 years after Michael Myers murders his sister, and he's returned to the town of Haddonfield, making for a Halloween night Laurie Strode and her friends will never forget. So I kind of just want to start by asking you kind of your Halloween origin story. The first time you saw it, and what about the film really stuck with you all these years?
I first saw it when I was probably 10 or 11. I rented a bunch of videos with my friends, kind of like we did for The Exorcist. It might have been the same night, actually. And we actually watched, we didn't get through The Exorcist, but we got through Halloween. And what stuck with me, and I guess what sticks with everybody, is Michael Myers. And just that mask and his looming presence throughout the whole movie. When he's not on screen, he's still in your mind. You know, it's super creepy to this day. You know, he's just everywhere at once, kind of. He's this omnipotent presence throughout the whole movie. And especially as a kid, it really creeped me out.
It was definitely a defining slasher just because, obviously, like you, I saw it very young. It was one of the first ones I think that I saw. And it feels very accessible in a way that I don't necessarily know a lot of other slashers are. I mean, for me at least, I watched it, I think my dad showed it to me when I was like 10 or 11, but it was the first horror movie that I saw that was set in a place that looked somewhat familiar to me, right? And I think that's kind of the magic of it, is that it doesn't take place at Camp Crystal Lake, right? It doesn't take place at a summer camp. It doesn't take place in a dream world where Freddy Krueger is going to jump out and get you. It takes place in a perfectly nondescript suburban neighborhood. And for me, that was something that made me look at like my neighborhood that I grew up in, and I was like, oh shit. I remember there's streets in the film that look like streets that I've seen around my neighborhood or my neck of the woods type of thing. And it brought the horror home for me in a way that movies that were kind of like monster focused or more supernatural hadn't before.
Absolutely. It really makes you not want to walk around at night. I grew up in a suburban setting too, and it makes where you live creepy. Like you said, it brings the horror home. And it's not the first slasher movie, right? But it's the one you should maybe watch first if you're going to get into slashers, because it's just perfectly done, and it's just really, really, like you said, accessible and relatable almost. Like it's your life if there was a crazy guy walking around killing everybody, you know?
Mm-hmm. It's probably like the least far-fetched of all the slashers, right? Again, it being
Right.
devoid of the supernatural, at least in the first film, for the first, I don't know, it's like 98% of the movie is pretty grounded in a lot of ways. Granted, the sequels go off in some pretty wild and supernatural directions and whatnot, but it is a film that, I mean, you'd leave the theater, you'd stop watching it, and then you're just like looking over your shoulder and whatnot. It's like he could just run up on you, because that's what he does to all of his victims in a way that, I mean, at least for me, I was just like, oh man, I should probably like make sure all the windows and the doors are locked and stuff like that.
Which they don't do in this movie at all. They go out of their way to leave every door open behind them, you know?
Right. But some just kind of like bullet point facts about Halloween that I find incredible now looking back on it. But like the reading and the documentaries that I've been watching on it, it really is remarkable just how much of kind of this thrown together rock and roll atmosphere was in creating this movie. Like, this was John Carpenter's third movie. Before this, he had done Dark Star, which was a supernatural movie, and then he did Assault on Precinct 13, which was like an action western, essentially. And so this was his first stab at horror. And even though the movie, by today's standards, you might think it looks like very low budget and kind of bare bones, it still had a budget of like $300,000, which, again, thinking about like studios actually producing horror movies, that sounds like a lot for the time period, even though it's considered like an indie budget. But that movie went on to make like $47 million in the US box office off of that $300,000 budget, which makes it like the most successful indie, I think, ever made, independent film ever made, which is nuts.
Yeah, just a little bit of a nice return on that. You know, did pretty well.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, Carpenter was only paid, I think, $10,000 to write, direct, and he scored the film, which,
of course,
I mean,
yes.
That's one of the things that I really want to get into in a minute is the score, because one of the links between all the Carpenter films, or the ones that I've talked about with people so far, is just Carpenter's ability to take a very simple score, a very simple premise, and yet make it into something that withstands the test of time in a way that I don't know many filmmakers can say, because we all have our favorite movies returning kind of to the well from directors that we all love, and yet I don't know if there's a director like Carpenter that has just such a phenomenal stretch of films, right? I feel like Carpenter, he's got runs where it goes like 4 or 5 films in a row that are just bangers. Whereas some directors that we might be fans of, it's like, yeah, they make great movies, but in between every classic of theirs, there might be 2 or 3 duds in there. That really stems from his creative control in a lot of ways, especially with Halloween. Like, he's like, yeah, I'm going to write or co-write, I'm going to direct, and I'm going to do the score. And you see him come into that kind of creative responsibility in a way that really shows how much these films can flourish, that are kind of a majority of the film has his stamp on it, so to speak. Whereas some of the other movies that he makes later on, when he's not in control of certain elements, it almost feels like something's missing from some of those movies.
The simplicity of the score you mentioned is perfect, because the movie is simple. It's a very simple, straightforward tale. There's no supernatural stuff going on, and the score matches it just perfectly. Just that little, here's what's going on, just a little creeping in your head there. This movie stays with you because it's so simple and so well done. You know, the things that happen in this movie are very realistic. This could really happen, you know, except for maybe Michael driving a car, you know, which you could get into or whatever. But it's very, very straightforward. It's not dumb in any way. Like, it's very well done, but it's simple and straightforward, and that's the best way to make a horror movie.
And that's what I think I was getting at with like the simplicity of the movie, or rather the accessibility of the movie just from that simplicity. It doesn't take a great deal to buy into anything, right? I mean, it's about a guy that escapes from a mental facility and then comes back to the town where he murdered his sister. Like, yeah, there's nothing about that is unbelievable. Again, there might be some pause over him driving after being incarcerated for 15 years, but it is a movie after all. But
exactly,
it really is fantastic, that simplicity, and that there's nothing that you can kind of look at and be like, well, that would never happen. Because it's like, well, it's so simple. It's on Halloween night. It's about a guy trying to kill a group of girls. And that's the whole pitch for the movie. And the fact that this film is as memorable as it is based off of that simplicity, it really shows just how well Carpenter and Deborah Hill are able to really kind of capitalize on simplicity and then take that, maybe the attention that goes into crafting a simple story, it gets applied to like the soundtrack, it gets applied to the performances that are so fantastic, and of course like the cinematography in this movie, which I really love. And it really strikes me as odd that this movie was so considered low budget, and yet even in 2020 it looks as good as it does. Like,
there are some really incredible shots in this movie. You know, like what comes to mind immediately is right after the 1, 2, 3 punch in the bedroom of the 3 dead people, then she walks out and she's panicking, and he kind of appears in silhouette over her shoulder. I think that's my favorite shot in the movie, and it's so simple, and just the way it's lit. I know maybe he lit the movie that way because of the budget or something like that, but it just serves the movie even more because it's perfect. All you see is his face. You know, we all know what shot I'm talking about. Like, it's just perfect, and it's simplicity again.
Again, coming back to like the idea of this being very much the suburban nightmare, it's what I love so much in that there's no standout location amongst the entire movie, right? There are specific locations that we become familiar with, whether it's the kid that Laurie is babysitting or the neighbor's house. But at the end of the day, these are just houses in a suburb. And I really like the way that the sheriff of the town frames it to Loomis. At one point, he's like, do you know what Haddonfield is? It's families, children lined up in rows, and you're telling me they're lining up for a slaughter. Like, that is a line that it really strikes at the core of the film, in that this is just a normal kind of like apple pie American town, and all of a sudden there's this unimaginable horror there, but it is very imaginable, right? I mean, if you look at the era, this film came out in, it came out in 78. I mean, this is the time when like all these serial killers started popping up, and then through the 80s and the 90s and all of these things. So it would be very surreal, I think, to watch this movie in those days when you had serial killers popping up, because what about this movie is implausible, other than like the very last minute of the movie, which we'll get into. But I mean, there isn't anything very unrealistic about it, in the way that it's like, yeah, it's a group of girls being stalked by a crazy guy. How many stories like that have we read over the years and things like that? Yeah,
it's almost a little tamer than the actual news, you know, than stuff that has actually happened, you know. I know in one of the sequels I read, I haven't seen it, but they have a line like, so 5 people got killed in one night, what's the big deal?
Right.
You know, which really would be kind of a reaction now or to something like this. But it's just the environment it's in, and the direction, and the perfect, like, it's almost like Jaws on land, like where you know you can kind of feel this guy everywhere, and it's really, like you said, realistic. Like, he's there's nothing in this movie that you can't believe, and that's part of what makes it so scary.
Absolutely. And I think that, again, this film serves as yet another example of Carpenter's ability to create tension in the opening moments of the film. But before we're even introduced, before we have context to anything, before we meet a single character, I mean, it starts with that score. And the score of this film, which he scored, and I think, again, his breakneck speed of pace and making scores and writing and these things, I think he made the score in 3 or 4 days. And imagine spending 3 or 4 days making something, and it precedes you almost, because it's probably one of the most memorable tracks in all of horror, like in horror history in terms of soundtracks. I mean, everybody recognizes that, or they at least associate it with Halloween, like the quote unquote like holiday, the festivity. I mean, whether or not you've seen Halloween or any of the sequels, you still recognize this is a Halloween song to a certain degree. And I just love how the film opens, in that it just starts with a black screen and a pumpkin. And it's kind of, as the beat or the tempo of that track picks up, the pumpkin slowly starts getting closer and closer to the screen. And it's so simplistic, and yet it is very ominous in an opening that you really wouldn't expect to like be that on edge from a pumpkin getting closer and closer to the screen, you know?
Right. Yeah, it's so straightforward, and everything he did in this movie is so straightforward, and that's part of why it's so kind of resonant. But like, it must be difficult as a filmmaker to toe that line between simplistic and dumb, and obviously he does that perfectly. But like, he took risks by making it so simple. Like I know the original opening shot was supposed to be like a sidewalk, and then you come up on the title screen or whatever, and then he was convinced, or he decided to just make it the jack-o'-lantern thing, and there must have been some part of him that's like, that's dumb, but then you see it and it's not dumb at all, you know. But maybe in his head it might have been before. Like, it is a little bit of a risk, but it's just, thank God he made that risk, took that risk rather, because it's just perfect.
Yeah, and again, I can't imagine, again, it was very low budget, it was an indie film, and yet I can't imagine that deciding to film the sidewalk alternative opening with the mask on the ground or whatever the
Right.
shot was, I can't imagine that would have been incredibly more expensive than the pumpkin angle. You know what I mean? And so that's a reasonable backup option almost. And so for him to have the foresight to be like, well, it's not necessarily going to save us money, but I just think creatively this is the right opening to start with. And it makes all the difference, because if it had just been a sidewalk with the music, it's almost different because you're getting context for something. You're getting context, oh, this is going to be in a neighborhood. This is going to be around Halloween, around a mask, whereas it's just a pumpkin, which on its own is not very ominous. And yet when you add that music and then you start to see that it's a carved pumpkin and it's a jack-o'-lantern, and that just, again, amplifies this relatively simple shot that just crafts this really great ominous tone that, I mean, it carries out throughout the entire film, because the way that the movie opens then is very seemingly normal at first until we get that great opening kill of Michael Myers killing his sister. But something that I wanted to jump into was just like the shape. Michael Myers, this idea of what makes him such a prolific slasher killer for you, because obviously slasher killers are essentially like a dime a dozen almost. We've got Freddy, Jason, Leatherface, all these kind of staples, and then you've got, I don't know how many other hundreds or thousands of slashers, but what about Michael Myers really stands out to you?
I think what really stands out is his inhumanity. Like, there's nothing you can relate to about this guy at all. Like, Freddy has an origin story, Jason has an origin story, and it's all kind of emotional for those two, and at least you can see it that way. But Michael, there's nothing in Michael's background at the beginning. He's just a kid who kills his sister and then comes out with this blank look on his face and this bloody knife on his hand, and that's all you know about him. And it's like, okay, he's fucked from the very beginning. Like, that's just who he is. And his Dr. Loomis, of course, the reaction to even the mention of Michael and the idea of Michael, just the look that he gets in his eyes and the way he describes him, you know, the devil's eyes and things like that. Like, he's almost not human. There's almost something about him that is supernatural, even though it isn't, but it feels that way. You know, it feels just impossible to relate to this guy, which I think makes the movie even more terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that mystery is what makes him so terrifying. Again, it's what separates him from just being another guy in a mask, right? Everybody has their motivations. Leatherface is this cannibal who's like mentally challenged, who falls into this thing with his family that's what they do. They eat people, they kill people. Where Leatherface, or rather Jason, he drowns in the lake and whatnot. He wants revenge for that on the teens that didn't protect him. But Michael, it's like one day he just decides, I'm going to kill my sister. And then I'm going to come back for whatever reason. You don't even know why he comes back. And so having to guess kind of, or create your own story, I feel like, for why he's doing the things he does is ultimately going to be more terrifying than being straight up told, where that was, before we started recording, we kind of talked about the Rob Zombie take on it, where he's basically like an abused kid, and this is what happens when you abuse kids. And it's like, well, that doesn't make him scary anymore, because you kind of understand why he's doing the things he's doing, and there's this whole explanation, and by demystifying him, he becomes less scary because you understand. Whereas if you just look at Michael Myers as a thing that does random acts of violence, I mean, that is much more terrifying, because you clearly can't reason with them, but also you don't know how much more that kind of like wrath is going to extend. Is he just targeting one person? Is he targeting anybody? That kind of like guessing game for me makes him incredibly terrifying in this thing that we never truly understand, at least in the context of like the first film.
Yeah, you wonder, like, what is he after? Does he have any sort of a code? Are these kids in danger, the little kids? And the only thing in the movie I would say that speaks to his what he's after at all, or his code, is when he sees the little kid getting bullied and the one bully runs away and all he does is grab him. He just holds him there for a second, scares the shit out of him and lets him go. And like, it's almost Michael taking a stand against bullying, right? Or whatever, however you want to interpret that. But like, that's the only thing that you could even feel like you could negotiate with him about. Like, he just does not have there's no moral center there. There's no motivation. He's just like, he's a shape. He's just a thing walking around doing these things. Well,
I love too that, I mean, he's been institutionalized for so long, but also this idea that he is not human. When he kills one of the girls who's on the phone and she's calling Laurie for help, and then he picks up the phone and he like puts it to his ear and he kind of just like looks at it and he doesn't really know what to do with it. Almost like little moments like that, or when he kills somebody, he kind of just like does a head tilt, like he's admiring his work. Like, it's almost like he doesn't know how to behave in the real world in a sense that makes him seem like a foreign object in the world, basically. Like, he doesn't fit into any scenario and all he can do is just kill his way through all of his problems, or just kind of like kill his way through the world, because that's all he knows how to do at this point.
That's all he is.
Yeah.
That's why I say it's like Jaws on land, because it is almost like you're dealing with a shark.
Yeah.
Like, he's got nothing to him except murder. He's just all about murdering.
This is his primal instinct, and he's been restraining that instinct for a long time. But I really love Loomis, who's played by Donald Pleasance, because Loomis really does a great job of dehumanizing him, to the point where he only calls him Michael or Michael Myers, I think, once or twice in the whole film. It's always, he refers to him as an it, or as the evil. He refers at one point, he says, the evil is gone from here. And little bits of dialogue like that do so much legwork in dehumanizing Michael, and kind of Loomis making sure everybody that he comes into contact realizes, like, this is not somebody that the end goal is not to put him back away. The end goal is that we probably are going to have to kill this thing, because it's not even a person. It's a pure embodiment of evil in a way that nobody you've ever encountered has been before. Yeah, like the build up to the actual, before you even see him, he's talking about, it doesn't do this, it doesn't do that. And the nurse says to him, can we call it him? Mm-hmm. And he says, yeah, if you want to, or whatever. Like, but instead of having like a weird flashback, or like showing the doctor working with young Michael or anything like that, or trying to reach him, you just have that dialogue when Donald Pleasance just saying, I tried to reach him for this many years, and I spent the other amount of years just trying to keep him behind bars, because I realized there's no getting to him. There's nothing to this guy. And that does all the legwork of establishing the character, to the extent he's even a character. He's more of a, like you said, like a thing or a shape. Yeah, and I think that it's really interesting. Obviously, he doesn't have dialogue in the movie, which not a lot of slasher villains do. But I think he might his breathing is more powerful than anything he could say. Like, if you look at somebody like Freddy Krueger is the guy who like has the one-liner. He likes calling people bitch, and he's got all these kind of like, he's having fun in killing. Whereas Michael, it's more just like clinical. It's just like, hey, I'm going through the motions, and capturing his breathing, especially in scenes when you don't see him first, right? There's one scene where I think Bob is going to get more beer, and Bob opens up one closet, he's not in there, but we know that Michael's there because we can hear him breathing. And that is more terrifying, because we assume that he's going to be somewhere and jump out and kill him, but knowing that he is in the room and not being able to see him, like, that is what makes that scene so terrifying. And there's several scenes like that where you just hear him breathing, and knowing that that presence is there, even if you can't necessarily see it, it really does heighten these very, again, simple scenes, simple frameworks for the actions that play out in these scenes where Michael is. But it really does make all the difference, instead of him having some kind of dialogue, or him saying, like, calling Laurie by her name or something like that. Yeah, that would lessen the impact of Michael as a killer. Like, and the breathing thing is like the only human thing about him. It's like a little reminder that he is technically a human being, and he does need to breathe, and he's breathing through this mask, and it's real loud, and that it's really ominous. Something that I think is really interesting too is that they make sure that they portray Michael the same way as they do in the later part of the film, but also in the beginning, right? That first kill where he kills his sister. we don't have him have some piece of dialogue with her or anything like that. It's just he's going through the motions. The only version of Michael Myers that the viewer knows is what we see from the very beginning, and it doesn't evolve from that. The first thing we see is he puts on that clown mask, he goes up and he stabs his sister to death. And he never alters from those early kind of behaviors or actions to the point where, again, it doesn't show like there's any growth or there's any degree of a person. He's always been the thing or it or the embodiment of evil from day one, basically.
Yeah, he's just this predator who just only grows physically. He just gets to be this big, tall guy. And he was dangerous when he was a little kid, and now he's even worse because he's a full-grown man and he's out. And he's the exact same predator he always was.
That's one thing I really loved about revisiting the original is that he looks like a normal guy, right? I mean, he's probably, 6 feet tall or something like that, but he doesn't look supernatural in his figure, right? I mean, Jason was always very like bulking and huge, and he only got bigger and bigger and taller as those movies went on. And that was one of the things that they did in the Rob Zombie movie that I didn't think was great. It was okay, but it wasn't great. But he's like 6'8", almost 300 pounds in that movie. So he's like a linebacker. So it's like, it's very difficult to see that unfolding as organically, because it's like, okay, so this freak of muscle athlete guy is like going to be chasing people around to kill them. It's like, okay, that's a little less realistic. Whereas if Michael Myers is just kind of this average guy, there's nothing physically special about him. It does make it, again, blend in more to this suburban horror. This could be a neighbor. This could be anybody that you see in the grocery store. The difference is that they're not wearing a mask and a Dickies paint suit. Right.
Yeah. And if you have him be this giant hulking presence, then it's kind of like, who gave him access to a weight room? Like, why was he doing that? Obviously you knew he was dangerous. It is much, much better that he's kind of a normal sized guy. The only physically scary thing about him is the mask, right? Like but that even the mask is meant to just make him look even less human, over the course of things. Like he's barely human. He's an apex predator who's just walking around stalking these people and stalking them expertly too. He's not dumb in any way. Like, he knows when to wait, he knows when to strike. He's just really, really good at this stuff. And it makes for a better movie. Thank God he is. It was obviously he was written, but yeah, he's, like when he waits for I can never get the two girls straight, the names of them. The girl who gets killed in the car, the way he waits for her and kind of ends up in the backseat of the car, that's just brilliant. The way he waits for it, he just takes his time, and he's not rushing anything. And that's another creepy thing about him, is that he's not in a hurry. He's just there to do his work. He doesn't really seem to care if anybody sees him. Like, he's driving around the whole movie. He's there. He's not super hiding. Like, he knows when to hide and when not to, and like, he's smart. Like, he waits for the cop to turn his back to drive by, but later on in the movie, he carries the body of the girl just through the front door, just for anyone to see who happens to be looking out the window. He doesn't seem to super care about stuff like that.
And now for a brief intermission. If you've been enjoying this episode of Daily Horror Habit, please take a moment to subscribe to the show on your preferred streaming platform or leave us a review on iTunes. And thank you for your continued support, and I hope you enjoy the remainder of today's horrifying episode. Right, and I think that, again, kind of like framing him as someone that is very intelligent in what they're doing, is like very methodical. Again, it kind of gets to the core of the idea that, if he wanted to and he was done killing people, or he got bored or tired or whatever, he could just take off the mask and just walk off down the street, and he would just blend into the neighborhood. And it was interesting reading about the mask that they ended up settling with. Like, originally it was supposed to be more like the mask that he wears when he kills his sister. It was supposed to be something to that extent, which was very creepy, but then again, it makes it seem not as realistic. Like, this is a clown killer now or something like that. Whereas the mask that they went with was like a cheap knockoff version of a Captain Kirk mask. Mm-hmm. And then they painted it white, obviously, and they made the eyes more open so they could black them out more. And I just love that, not only because it looks so strange, but it's very like emotionless, right? It looks like
it's an approximation of a
Yeah.
human, but not quite a human being.
Yeah, it's a human being, but at the same time, it's a lesser one almost at that. It's like you can't tell what he's thinking from that. Whereas if you have like a Leatherface, when he smiles or opens his mouth, the mouth still opens and stuff. But it is a it's very funny. I know you said you hadn't seen the sequels, but
Right.
the masks get progressively worse in the sequels for whatever reason. Like I think they lost the original one, and then the quality just kept like degrading for the next 3 or 4 sequels, to the point where it almost looks like cartoonish, where it just looks like some shitty mask that somebody just found on the ground somewhere. There's never an explanation for that, but it's very funny.
Yeah, I like that indie film thing where they don't know how important it's going to be, and they're just like, yeah, who cares about the mask? Somebody lost it, or somebody kept it, or whatever. We don't know what happened to it. Yeah, you just accidentally made like one of the greatest movies ever.
Well, that's the thing. Like when you think about indie movies and kind of like these rock and roll style productions where they're kind of running by the seat of their pants the whole time, they have, I mean, apparently there was like 5 different people on set that would play as Michael in certain points. Like Nick Castle is primarily the Shape, but then you had Deborah Hill, his co-writer and producer, who was the hands for when they did the first person shots at the beginning with the mask, just because they couldn't get the child actor that day or something. And so they're like, oh, we need a stand-in, and they just used her. And so when you think about it, it's like, how much of this is actually smart creative decisions and how much of this is luck? Granted, obviously there's tons of talent there because John Carpenter remains almost undefeated in my mind in terms of directors. But I mean, you have to think like how much of this is ingenuity and then how much of it is just like, hey man, we're just a group of kids that don't know what we're doing making a movie. I think they said the average age of everybody on staff was like 26 or something like that. And it's just like not super experienced people, but there's a passion for making something that is a standout from kind of the idea of what horror was, or slashers at the time, so to speak, before that genre like literally exploded. But it makes it's interesting watching the movie now and going back and watching it and being like, how is this not as meticulously planned as I thought it was in my head? Because it just holds up so well at almost every single level. Like that's why I revisit this movie so many times a year, because it really just, it is a phenomenal piece of filmmaking, whether it was completely intentional or not, you know?
Yeah, and it's got to be a lot of both, right? A lot of talent and a lot of luck. But the willingness, like you said, everybody, the average age was 26, and that speaks to the youthful willingness to take risks and to not necessarily know when they're doing something crazy or whatever, like something that's totally outside the box, and to almost accidentally make a classic. But of course, you have John Carpenter at the helm, so it's not super an accident. But yeah, it's probably a lot of both.
Yeah, so in terms of Laurie Strode, Jamie Lee Curtis's character, every single time I watch this movie, I get a better appreciation for her character just because of how, I mean, it's like played out to describe final girl characters is this, but like how pure of a character she is. There's a lot of times, like slashers get a bad rap a lot of the time for characters that aren't likable, or characters that the only reason you're rooting for them is that they're framed as the protagonist, right? It's like, oh, well, yeah, they're the protagonist, so I have to want them to survive, basically. But really, like, from the jump, she is such a remarkable character, and how she is just so pure in terms of, like, it's more about her being just good-natured, being so different from her classmates, and kind of this wanting to fit in and yet not willing to subscribe to maybe the attitudes and temperaments of some of her friends, like we learn in her interactions with them. What do you think of her as a final girl?
She's amazing, and I think part of it is that she's the only character you're really made to care about in the entire movie. Like everyone else is one-dimensional, and I think that's by design. Like the other girls are preoccupied with what young people might be preoccupied with, and she's studying, and she's the only babysitter. They're all babysitters, right? But she's the only one who cares about the kids, it seems. is really good with the kids, and she's like reading to him, and she's watching movies with him. He says, can we go make a jack-o'-lantern? He's like creeped out, and she says, I'm not going to let anything happen to you. You know, like you can really relate to her, and you like her right away, you know, because she really seems like a nice person, almost like a real human being, whereas everybody else is kind of one-dimensional, like I said. But yeah, and I think that's by design, because she really stands out, especially with her dumb friends. You know, it's almost like, why is she friends with these people in the first place? But by the end of it, I think you're rooting for her the whole time. And she's really the only one who sees Michael, because she's the only one who's paying attention. Yes. They're all like looking the other way and doing other things, but she's acutely aware of her surroundings. Mm-hmm. And of course, as a viewer, you're aware of the surroundings too. So you're like, look, it's Michael Myers right there. And she's trying to say the same thing. So she's, of course, as any protagonist, is a stand-in for the viewer, but she's really likable, you know, and she's obviously very resourceful, and as we see in the end.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great point you made, in that we are so in tune with her, because she reacts as you would hope yourself would. Like, I would be super aware of what's going on. I would start connecting the dots, like, hey, I saw that strange car earlier. Hey, there's this weird guy with a mask that keeps reappearing. Like you said, though, like her friends are just like, oh, it's probably so and so. Like, I don't know if I would be just kind of like explaining these coincidences away when we're getting to like the fifth or sixth instance. But something that I really appreciate too is that brief moment when she's in class, right? And she's staring out the window, kind of daydreaming. And then she sees Michael, and that's like a creepy moment. But I was paying more attention this time to the fact that she's daydreaming. Her teacher calls on her. She asks her to repeat it, but then she immediately like knows the answer, which is a great way of showing not only how intelligent she is, but then that bleeds into her character being like the intelligent authority of the group. And yet she never kind of like flaunts that in people's faces, her friends' faces rather, or she's never necessarily arrogant in a way that, I don't know, some characters might if they are like the quote unquote smart one of the group. And that was just something that I think, again, that trickles down into how she deals with a threat that clearly none of her friends are able to, because as soon as her friends encounter Michael, we know how their fates go. And yet you have Laurie who's actually able to like defend herself, and she even tries to like fake him out at one point, right? When she goes to hide in the closet, she opens up the porch doors to make him think that she jumped out. And I just like even though he doesn't buy it, like that's an intelligent move that you would think that is very realistic, instead of like, oh, I'm just going to cower and hide, and that's the only place you could hide. I'm going to make him try to like think I went that way instead of me hiding in the closet.
Yeah, you're almost disappointed like that she's just hiding, but then you think, oh no, she's not just hiding. She has a whole plan, you know, and her using anything at her disposal to kind of try to incapacitate Michael. Like at first it's the crochet needle, and then the coat hanger, you know, and she gets him right in the eye with that thing. And you know, but twice she discards the knife like it doesn't mean anything, which frustrates me every time. Like, just pick up the knife. But still, he's going after her and trying to strangle her anyway, so it's not like he needed the knife, you know. But yeah, she's just really, really smart, and so is he. So, or at least he's cunning or whatever. I don't know if he could pass a written exam on anything. I don't know if he can read or write, but he's certainly a cunning predator, and she's every bit his match. So that's really cool.
Yeah. And one other thing about just like her being the intellectual one of the group of friends is that her character never comes off as like a wet blanket, right? Because she's hanging out with these people that she is clearly much smarter than, and yet she's never really rubbing it in their faces. But then at the same time, when they're doing like teenager things and they're driving around smoking in the car, she's never like, her character never becomes this kind of like preachy character, like you really shouldn't be doing that or this and that. She kind of is along for the ride to a certain point. But then even like when she hits the joint, you see her face and she's like, it's like so harsh for her or whatever. And it's kind of just, it never completely corrupts her or makes her viewed as just like one of her other friends who is like not paying attention to anything, is much more preoccupied with like boys and whatnot, but she's willing to participate, and yet it never kind of makes her forget kind of like who her character is introduced as almost.
Yeah, and I like one little thing that I really like is right after they run into the sheriff, or the other girl's dad, they've been smoking, and he like leans into the car, they open the window, and I'm thinking to myself, he's got to smell it. And then as they drive away, she says, he could smell it. I know that. Like she actually voices what you're thinking in that scene. It's like, okay, good. At least she said that, you know, because there's no way he wouldn't have smelled it. So.
Right. Whereas her friend is just like, oh no, he couldn't smell it. And it's just like, well, no, he definitely could. But that's a great point. You're right.
Yeah, like all her friends are just out to lunch completely, and that's probably why they get killed, right? Like, because they're not super paying attention.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But also, I mean, Laurie Strode's character is so fantastic as being, she's not completely a victim. She's one of Michael's victims, and yet her intellect puts her a peg above the actual victims, right? But then at the inverse of that, you have Donald Pleasance, who is this authority on what is happening, and yet he fights so long to be heard, essentially. And his character is super fascinating to me because his character is a certain type of authority, and yet his character is perceived as like the hero, but he is terrified the entire movie. He is fearful.
Yes.
All he does is communicate to everybody how terrified he is, how terrified they should be, which, in thinking about like the traditional kind of hero archetype, the hero is always supposed to be this person that is like, I can solve any problem with a gun or my gusto for whatever my mission is. Whereas we learn that Loomis has a gun, and yet he almost like squeezes off a few rounds when that part of the house falls down and breaks a window. Like, he is terrified to his core. There's nothing about him that is brave. There's nothing about him that makes him seem like he's a physically dominating force. And even though he has a gun, I mean, he doesn't come off as being intimidating with it. And it's just a very interesting dynamic for the perceived hero of the film to have.
It really is, and I haven't really thought about it that way, but that's very true, and that's a great point. Like, he's almost doing it out of a sense of duty rather than courage or any kind of like gusto, or I'm gonna go get him and I'm gonna take care of this and I'm the only one who can solve this problem. He doesn't have that bravado to him at all. Like, the sheriff says to him, "Oh, it seems to me you're just plain scared," and he says, "Yeah, I guess I am." Like, he doesn't shy away from that at all. Like, he is terrified and he just wants everybody else to understand what's going on.
It's probably why like his fear is so infectious that he's able to talk to Brackett the way he does. Basically, he tells Brackett at one point, he's like, "Tell your men to keep their mouths shut and their eyes open." It's like, dude, you just got here and you're telling the sheriff and what they need to be doing, and yet Brackett buys into it because he's like,
he listens.
He listens after seeing just how terrified he is. And I mean, Donald Pleasance, I love Donald Pleasance, and this is probably, in terms of the other, because he went on to do 2 other Carpenter films, and this is probably my favorite performance of his, just in terms of, he's barely in any of the movie too. He leaves such an impact, and I think he's only in like 15 minutes of the movie maybe, or 20 minutes of the whole movie. And just the way that it's chopped up, it makes it seem like he's this presence that is always there. And yet going back and realizing how little of the movie he's in, like, it just kind of reinforces how much you're hanging on, or how much I was hanging on to every single one of his words. And just the idea that he describes evil as coming to Haddonfield. And just, he gives such a phenomenal performance that it really is one of those performances that is so, his fear is made so palpable that he doesn't even have to say much. It's more about how he's selling the few lines that he has that makes his character so impactful.
Yeah, and a lot of times he's just kind of looking out, especially in that first scene when you meet him and he's in the car, he's kind of looking out the window and nothing terrible has happened yet. He's just dreading having to go take Michael to in front of the judge. He doesn't even want to see him. He has this really palpable sense of dread. He's staring out the window like, all right, here's what we got to do. And, I'm going to explain to you what's happening, but I'm scared now. And you can just feel the fear throughout his whole performance. And he doesn't have to say much.
And what I love too is that his character is so fearful and so on edge, and yet they incorporate a few moments of showing Loomis more kind of like laid back almost, where like when he's going through the graveyard with the graveyard keeper or whatever you want to call him, and the guy's like telling him this salacious story about a murder that happened. The guy gets right to the punchline and Loomis is like, "Are we almost there?" Basically just like completely kills the guy's vibe because he is so determined in, I need to know this information. Nothing, your bullshit story about gossip is not going to interfere with that. And we even get another moment where these neighborhood kids are like running onto Michael Myers' house's porch. And then I love this moment. He's in the bushes and he's like, "Lonnie, get your ass out of here." And he like has this little laugh to himself. And then Brackett comes up behind him and scares the shit out of him. Like, it's a fantastic moment that shows, as uptight as his character is, he is still a person, right? Because at that point, he's almost kind of comparable to Michael in a way, whereas Michael's sole thing is killing. Loomis's sole purpose, it seems, all of these years has been Michael Myers. And to see him talk about or interact in anything that's not Michael Myers related, I feel like just a brief glimpse of it, it still shows that he's human. He can still be a kid, almost like, oh, I'm going to scare the shit out of these kids for a minute. Like, it's not always Michael Myers 100% of the time. Maybe it's 98% in his life. But that little moment of levity, it really does humanize him in a great way, I think.
Yeah, and so does his fear. Like, you get the feeling that Michael Myers doesn't even
That's true.
know to be afraid of anything. I couldn't imagine him being afraid of anything. But then, Loomis is afraid of Michael Myers, and just to a degree where you feel like he kind of changed his life when he met him. Like, he was just so troubled by the idea of this kid even existing.
Mm-hmm.
And then him getting out, it's like, all right, I got to do every last thing I can to stop this, but I would probably rather not be here.
Right.
He
just wishes this was not his mission in life, unfortunately. But that kind of speaks to the tragic nature of his not as only his profession, but of his situation, right? He's had to dedicate his entire life, even if this kid has been locked up for 15 years. He even says, like, I was trying to work with him, rehabilitate him, and then I spent all this time trying to keep him locked up. None of this kind of like, oh, we're going to rehabilitate and then release him. His whole goal, or last 15 years, has probably been spent ensuring that Michael Myers cannot escape. And something that they tackle in some of the later films to a lesser degree, but it's still interesting to see the different ways that they examine that relationship between Dr. Loomis and Michael Myers. But I think we should get into some of our favorite kills in the movie, because this movie, again, it's key in its simplicity, and yet I feel every single kill is memorable, even if by today's standards you might be like, well, they're not that creative of kills, maybe they're not the goriest of kills or the bloodiest of kills, and yet it's the way that Carpenter presents everything, every single kill, that is super memorable. So what's one of your favorite kills from the movie?
I love when the girl in the car, it's Annie, is that? No, Annie's the other one. I'm not sure which is which, but the girl, when she goes to the car, it's so well done, because at first it's locked, and she has this big journey to go get the key, and she gets the key, she comes back, and then it's unlocked. She doesn't put the key in it, and it seems to dawn on her a little bit, and then she sees that someone has been breathing in the car, that it is coming from the inside, the condensation or whatever it is, and then he grabs her from behind. I mean, that's just brilliant. Like, that's probably my favorite kill in the whole movie, because the realization that she has right before he grabs her is, oh, there's somebody in this car with me. Like, she's trying to get rid of the stuff on the windshield, and she realizes it's coming from the inside. That's just brilliant.
I love too that she's like whistling the entire time. She walks to the car, it's locked. She's like, ah, shit, I gotta get my keys. She walks back in, she's whistling. She gets to the car. When she opens the door, she doesn't realize it's been unlocked, and she sits down, and she's whistling the entire time. And once she sits down in the seat, she stops whistling, because she realizes, hey, wait, that was locked a minute ago. And then it goes into her wiping away the condensation, and then of course he grabs her. But what I really love about that scene too is that we get two perspectives, right? It's shot from the passenger seat of the car, and we see him sit up and choke her out. But then it also cuts to the other side, where the window is filled with condensation, and so our vision of it is a little blurred. And yet, jumping between those two perspectives, I mean, it really does make for a more intimate scene, in that you get that kind of, I don't know if it's necessarily salacious, but you get that more kind of like personal, oh, this guy's choking this person out inside the car. And then the exterior shot is showing you the kind of like muffled from afar version of what is happening. And that contrast, I think, is really interesting. It's interesting to kind of have you're a participant and then you're a viewer, in a way that just jumping around with the perspective like that, it makes it more of a dynamic scene than I think it should be, right? Because at the end of the day, it's just a guy choking a woman, which you've seen in how many movies. Like, there's nothing all that remarkable about what's happening, but it's more about the way that it's presented, I think, that really stands out.
Yeah, switching between those two points of view is really fantastic. Like, that's just Carpenter being a genius, right? Like, okay, here's how we can make this more interesting. And then to leave her on the horn, honking, laying on the horn is just such a nice little little bow on top of the whole scene.
Well, I love too that we get that moment where I think it's the little boy, he hears the horn, right? And so we get his perspective, and then we get one last perspective inside the garage. And so our association with what that horn represents is much different than obviously the neighbors. But again, it kind of reinforces this idea that this nightmare is unfolding in the suburbs and people are dying horrific deaths. And yet it's not so dramatic that the entire neighborhood is taking notice, or it's the entire neighborhood is, there's like a posse going around trying to hunt down the killer, right? Nobody finds out about it probably until Loomis kills Michael, because he's the one that's firing a gun off that's going to draw attention. That's the one thing that the neighborhood can't dismiss. You can dismiss a car horn, you can dismiss a car backfiring, all of these things. A gunshot you cannot, multiple gunshots you cannot, but it's not until the last 90 seconds of the movie where things finally occur to the degree that the entire neighborhood can't not take notice.
Yeah, and even Dr. Loomis, like, his plan is really, when you think about it, not all that great, because he's just walking around. He's just kind of walking around looking at, and he happens to be in front of the house when the kids come screaming and running out, and he says, "Oh shit, it must be Michael." But and that's a nice little happenstance there. But yeah, and until that moment, it's all very small. It's all, or at least insular. Like, there's no way that everybody could possibly know what's going on. But except for Dr. Loomis, right? And he knows something's happening behind one of these doors, and he gets lucky with the kids running out and screaming. But yeah, that's really good.
I think probably my favorite kill is going to be when Bob goes down to get another beer.
Love that one.
Yeah, and then of course, like I said earlier, there's this moment where you don't see Michael, and there's a fake out where he goes to check one of the cabinets and there's nobody in there. But you can hear Michael breathing, and that breathing really sets the tone in a way that it's like, okay, the evil is in the room, or the evil is in the house. And having that confirmation that he's there and you can't see him is so terrifying to me. It's kind of like in, I don't know if you've seen Hereditary, but there's like this clicking sound that occurs. And the clicking sound,
I have, yes.
You have seen it. Okay, so the clicking sound, absolutely. Right? I mean, initially, it's not that it's somebody making a clicking sound. There's nothing on its own about that that's scary. But when you incorporate it into the greater meaning behind that, like, it becomes terrifying in that film. And it's the same thing with the breathing in Halloween. Whereas, okay, it's a guy breathing on its own. There's nothing scary about that. And yet what that's associated with in Halloween just kind of heightens every scene that it's used in. And I mean, that scene where he grabs Bill and then he's not only Bob, and he's picking up by his throat, that's like the one supernatural moment of the film, right? That this man is able to pick somebody up by their throat with one hand and hold him there,
right?
And then stab him and pin him to the wall. Like, that is probably the most other than him surviving getting shot, but that's probably the one moment where it's like, oh, maybe this guy's superhuman. He's got this superhuman strength, and yet he still carries himself like he is a machine, like he's a man still, because once he stabs the guy and he just kind of like tilts his head and looks at him like he's observing his handiwork, but there's no really like celebration or glee in it. It's kind of just like instinctual, almost like he's standing there. He's like, I'm going to make sure this guy's really dead so I can go kill somebody else, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's very clinical the way he kind of evaluates the dead body. Like, he's just kind of looking at it like he's interested, and like he's making sure, and you don't quite know what's going through Michael's head at that moment, which is, you never should. You never do, and you never should. Like, that's part of what makes him Michael Myers, right?
Yeah, and I think that what I love so much is that all of those little moments that I was just talking about, like the breathing sound, the soundtrack and everything, all of that cuts when he's examining the body. Like, there's no more breathing, there's no more soundtrack. It's just kind of like we're in this space with Michael admiring his handiwork, and yet if there had been music there might have been, that music might have served as a celebratory or something like that for him, at least. Like, oh, I killed another one kind of thing. Whereas it's almost as if he's just doing these things because he doesn't know what else to do. It's not like he enjoys it. He's not a Freddy. He's not giving a one-liner or taking any pleasure in what he does. Whereas Michael, it's just like, yeah, man, this is just what I do, which is terrifying in and of itself, because at least you can understand why Freddy does the things he does. Whereas Michael, again, it comes back to why he is such a prolific slasher icon in my mind, is because it's like there's no explanation for anything. And that's probably my least favorite trend that a lot of the sequels tried to do, where they tried to explain things. And it's like, we don't need more explanation. The more you
No, that's what makes it scary.
Yeah, the more you explain things and demystify it, it's like, okay, so it's a guy in a mask that was abused as a kid or something like that. And you're just like, okay, so there's no more mystery, so I'm not wondering. I mean,
yeah,
that's what's so great about this movie, is that it's so simple. I've seen it dozens of times, probably more than that. And it's still a movie that I think about constantly, because we're not given any answers for anything. And while the answers might not be even that interesting, like, it's that ambiguity that really makes it stick in your mind in a way that movies that feel the need to explain everything just don't.
Yeah, that's the best part of this character, is that nothing is explained. You can project whatever you want onto it, but it's probably better not to just see him as this force who doesn't really have anything going on in his head except, here's what I'm doing. Like, and like you said, everything cuts out, the sound cuts out when he's tilting his head, and that's almost like what's going on in his head is like just blank, just nothing, and that's why are you killing these people? There's no answer. And that makes it much scarier than if he had some kind of a background in any way, if you understood this character in any way.
And you and I were talking earlier before we started recording just about how shocked we were at the realization of just how little actual blood or violence is in the movie. I mean, it's one of those things, again, like I was talking about with you earlier, in that everybody assumes like, oh, the most famous slasher movies, they have to be known for all their excessive blood and gore and all these things. And it's like, that's not really what a lot of these movies were about. Like this movie, Halloween or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, are two fantastic slashers that kind of kickstarted the whole essence of what slashers are. And yet those movies have a handful of drops of blood in them. And it kind of just goes to show that the idea of what a general audience thinks of a slasher is not really at the core of what those movies started out as. And if anything, I mean, I like some of the sequels for various slasher movies, but the reason that we keep coming back to the originals is because it wasn't about excessive amounts of blood. It wasn't about shocking you with this crazy violence. It was more about the way that they framed these things and how they crafted that tension, and how it was more about the filmmakers rather than what they were actually filming that made it masterpieces in my mind in terms of horror movies.
Absolutely. Yeah, very, very well said. Like, it's a lot of this movie happens in your head, or whatever you're thinking is dangerous, or when you're with Laurie the whole time, obviously in her, like you're on her side, and you kind of understand what she's thinking the whole time. But with Michael, you just don't need all this blood. Like I think the first on-camera kill besides his sister is almost an hour into the movie, so it's clearly not what it's about. We only have like 34 minutes or so of the movie left when he first kills the girl. Like, so that's when his actual kill spree on Halloween night starts. He, obviously he killed his sister and then the truck driver off screen, but his Halloween spree doesn't start until an hour into the movie. So that's clearly not the point of the movie, is for him to have all this gory kills or whatever. It's more about the atmosphere of it, the kind of the feel that John Carpenter brings.
Yeah, it's more about his presence, right? It's more about an evil presence being in the town. And yeah, obviously an evil presence is going to do evil things and he's going to end up killing people, but it really is more about Michael infecting this town, more so than I think a lot of other slasher icons, because usually the slasher icons, or I keep referring to them as that, but like Freddy or Jason or whatever, it's always the victims are going to them, whereas the vigilant or the antagonist is coming to Haddonfield, right? So he's coming and his presence is known, but it's not necessarily known in violent acts that are immediately aware to the rest of the town. It's more about these little moments like, oh, this weird guy's popping up. Some quote unquote kids broke into the hardware store and stole masks and knives and rope, which I feel like Brackett should be a little more concerned about that. Like, that's like three very kind of like ominous items to steal from a hardware store. But I mean, in terms of like, there's no immediate red flags. There's lots of, maybe we'll call them like yellow flags, but there's no event that immediately sets the town on edge. And I think that is a very not supernatural, but it's more of just like he is this presence, and Carpenter portrays that in a really smart way. He does that with that atmosphere rather than having it be the body count be 15 or 20 people.
Yeah, and that would make the movie that wouldn't be as good a movie if all that stuff was going on, if they didn't build up to it. And there's really, it's not like nothing happens, because you get these scares every so often in the movie just from him being there, just from him popping up in random spots. You don't what he did all these years ago, and you know what he's capable of because of Donald Pleasance's character, but you don't see it until later, and you don't need to. Like, you just know that he's evil and that something terrible is happening, and that it's really bad that he's around, and you keep spotting him, and it's like, oh shit, there he is. And you don't even super know what you're afraid of at the beginning, like he's just kind of there, but you trust Donald Pleasance's character so much because the performance is so convincing that this is really, really bad that he's back in Haddonfield.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because there's that scene at the end where Michael gets into a struggle with Laurie, and she rips his mask off, and we get a brief glimpse of his face. And John Carpenter talked about that moment in that he says the power of suggestion, because he said that lots of people would tell him that the scariest part is when you see Michael's disfigured face. And John Carpenter said, well, we didn't do anything to his face. There's a little bit of makeup on his eye to show his eye was gouged. But it's not as if his face is inhuman. It's not like he looks like a burn victim or something like that. He's just a guy in a mask. And so, again, like it could have been very easy to have a big scare when you take the mask off. He looks like Jason. He's all deformed or something. But again, it's a guy in a mask. And yet all of the tension and kind of legwork that Carpenter puts into the film for the entire runtime, he's able to have that payoff, when in reality the payoff is, it's what we assumed all along. It's just a guy in a mask.
Right.
That can get shot half a dozen times.
And fall out a window and walk away. But it's really good that he's just a guy, because that's the groundwork that he lays the whole time for her to pull off the mask, and you could just see a perfectly normal guy, and it's still terrifying because of the reveal, not because of what his face looks like, because the film is such an expertly made movie that even something that isn't scary on its face, no pun intended, is scary when that happens, Right. And again, it could have been I feel like had he had the reveal of his face and then it's just he's all disfigured or something like that, or he looks like a monster or something like that, then at the end you're just like, oh, well, if he's a monster or a supernatural person, all of a sudden, why didn't he do more? You know what I mean? Whereas when the reveal is that he's just human, you're like, yeah, that tracks. Based on everything else that was in the movie, that makes perfect sense. And that's the perfect kind of culmination of where the film's headed. And it serves as a fantastic finale to a fantastic film. It certainly does. Yeah, it's perfect.
And I mean, I love that ending too, because it really does reinforce Donald Pleasance's entire character in that he is justified in his fear. Again, whereas fear is usually used against a character, whereas another character will use it as a measure of their own character, saying like, oh, well, you're just a coward, you're fearful. At the end of the film, when Donald Pleasance looks down and Michael's not there, and then it cuts back up to Loomis's reaction, he doesn't look shocked, he doesn't look scared. He's just kind of like a blank face, like, oh, I knew this was going to happen. This is not surprising. Yeah. This is what I've been telling everybody. And in that, I don't know that he definitely doesn't get any joy or pleasure out of being right. But there is a type of solace there where it's like, he spends the whole movie trying to convince people. And to the degree, like, you almost think he starts to think he's crazy, right? He's going to tell everybody this madman, this evil is here and it's going to kill everybody. And yet, by the end of the movie, he's the only one that has been on the right side of the story. Yeah,
and like when he shoots him, he's still trying to fire even after Michael falls out the window. Like he realizes he hasn't done enough, and he knows that. And then there is kind of a look on his face after Michael's gone of like, well, I'm not crazy, and it is kind of a relief to him almost, and as much as anything like that could be a relief. This thing that he's been chasing this whole time is gone, and he has to, I guess the night continues or whatever, I don't know. But that's obviously it's a perfect place to end the movie.
Yeah, and I think that is something I picked up on more on my last rewatch was him dry firing, because it really is this idea that it doesn't matter if the gun has 6 bullets or it's got, I don't know, 60 or 6,000 or whatever. It's never enough.
Yeah.
There's never enough things that they can do to ensure that the evil is dead, because he believes in his heart that it is more of a thing than a person, right? This gun can help maybe the problem short term, but long term, there needs to be a bigger solution for this bigger problem. But yeah, and kind of wrapping up, were there any other scenes or moments that you like that I kind of skipped over?
I love just the little 1, 2, 3 punch of the corpses, the Judith Myers headstone on the bed, and then the I don't know how Michael arranged the guy to come off the closet like that and to hang down. That's pretty great. I don't know if he taped his feet up there or what, but he took his time with that one just to scare the shit out of Laurie and us, and then the girl in the little cupboard there, and then of course him just over Laurie's shoulder. Just really, that blows me away every time. Just that, I think it's like a 4-minute sequence, if that. Like that's just.
And that is a great way to show like him displaying his handiwork as it was. And then at the same time, though, it's just bodies that are lying there. Obviously, it's very disturbing and gruesome, but it's not over the top, right? We're not like getting decapitated people or excessive amounts of blood. It's just these people, they leave the bodies and the corpses. They have to be recognizable because these are her friends. These are people.
Right.
These are not people. These are not just strangers or people she met at a party that she was hanging out with. These are her best friends, essentially, or this is her immediate friend group. And it just makes their deaths have more of an impact on her, which, I mean, we're rooting for her the whole movie. So to see her as distressed as she is, I mean, it really does add a extra level of investment into it. But I really do love that shot, too, where his face just comes into frame and behind her. Like, that's probably, again, one of my favorite shots just because of how simple it is. It's not him walking through the door frame either, you know what I mean? It's just him standing there the whole time. But we only realize it about 10 seconds into the shot, because then it starts to fade in more and more and more. Even little moments like him he does, I mean, now we would call it like a stone cold sit up, where he just is lying on his back and then he sits up slowly and turns his head and looks at her. Like, that is such a simplistic body movement, but it doesn't look human the way he does it, right? If you got knocked on your back, you'd probably like roll over and then get on your knees and help you get up. You wouldn't just like sit up like the undead. And the fact that he does that, I mean, it carries so much weight, because it's like he's being reborn almost, or a machine or a robot is turning on.
Yeah, there's some kind of mechanical element to the way he sits up, and even the way he walks after that. Like, it's just, yeah, there's something inhuman about the whole character, and especially that setup. And
that was something, one last thing, in that Carpenter didn't give Nick Castle a lot of like stage direction, or I guess just directions in general, in terms of like Michael's motivation, why he's doing specific actions. He would tell Castle, like, Michael's only motivation is to get from point A to point B in a scene. And I think that really shows in a great way in conveying that it's not almost as if Michael is doing the things that he's doing because he's thinking about them ahead of time. It's like pre-programming. And I think in limiting Nick Castle in that regard, it really does come through in that performance in a way that, I mean, Nick Castle for me will forever be the Shape, just because there are moments in the other movies that I think they stand up okay, but there's no performance like his in the first film for me. Right on. But yeah, man, I appreciate you coming on to talk Carpenter and Halloween, and I think I'll give you a list of some of the sequels that are worth checking out in case you're interested. Hopefully I'll try to steer away from the ones that kind of get into the wacky mythology of Michael Myers, but there's a couple in there that I think you'll enjoy if you enjoy this one as much as you do. Absolutely, man. Yeah, I'm gonna binge them now, because I gotta see some of the sequels at least, and you gotta tell me which ones are good. Yeah, I'll tell you which ones to avoid. But as always, man, it's a pleasure having you on to chat horror. Thanks, man. Yeah, I appreciate it. It's always great to talk to you. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Daily Horror Habit on your preferred streaming service, and follow the show on Instagram at Daily Horror Habit and on Twitter at Daily Horror Pod for episode updates. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.